Their love story began like so many others, simple and pure. It was a sun-drenched afternoon at a local fair, filled with the scent of popcorn and the sound of laughter. Mark saw Elena for the first time near the Ferris wheel. Her smile, he would later say, could have lit up the entire sky. They talked for hours that day, sharing dreams and secrets as if they had known each other forever. Their connection was instant, a magnetic pull that neither could explain nor deny. It was a love that felt destined, written in the stars long before they ever met. They promised each other forever, a vow whispered under a canopy of twinkling lights. Their early years of marriage were a beautiful symphony of shared moments. They built a life together, brick by brick, with laughter as their mortar and love as their foundation. They bought a small house with a porch swing, where they would sit on warm evenings, planning a future filled with children and grandchildren. Mark cherished the way Elena would hum while she cooked, the way her eyes would sparkle when she told a funny story. He believed their love was invincible, a fortress that could withstand any storm. It was a simple, profound happiness, the kind you read about in books but rarely find in the real world. Then the storm came. It wasn't a gentle rain but a hurricane that threatened to tear their world apart. A terrible mistake, a moment of poor judgment, and Elena was gone. She was sentenced to prison, and the life they had so carefully built crumbled into dust. Mark stood in the courtroom, his heart shattering into a million pieces as he watched her walk away. The world turned gray. The silence in their home was deafening. But amidst the wreckage of their dreams, one thing remained unbroken: his promise. He had vowed to love her through sickness and health, for better or for worse. And this, he knew, was the worse. He made a choice that day, a decision that would define the next decade of his life. He would wait. He would hold on to the memory of her smile, the warmth of her touch, and the sound of her laughter. He would be the anchor in her storm, the constant she could rely on. Loyalty for Mark was not just a word, it was the very essence of his love for Elena. He would visit her, write to her, and keep their home exactly as she had left it, a sanctuary waiting for her return. His friends called him a fool, his family worried, but Mark's heart knew only one truth: he would wait for his wife. The first year was the hardest. Every morning, Mark woke up reaching for her side of the bed, only to find it cold and empty. The house, once filled with her presence, felt like a hollow cavern echoing with memories. He would catch himself about to tell her something funny he heard at work, only to be struck by the painful reality of her absence. He went through the motions of life: work, eat, sleep, but it was a life devoid of color. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of waiting. He visited her every week, the drive to the prison becoming a familiar, somber ritual. He tried to keep their connection alive through letters and phone calls. He wrote to her every single day, filling pages with anecdotes about his day, memories of their past, and hopes for their future. He told her about the neighbor's new puppy, the promotion he got at work, and how the roses in their garden were blooming. He wanted her to feel like she was still a part of his world, even from behind bars. He would read her letters over and over, tracing her handwriting with his finger, trying to feel her presence in the ink. These letters were his lifeline, a fragile thread connecting his lonely present to a future he desperately prayed for. As years turned into a decade, the weight began to take its toll. The initial shock and raw grief slowly morphed into a chronic, dull ache in his heart. His friends stopped asking about her, their pity turning into a quiet, awkward silence. He became a ghost in his own life, a man frozen in time while the world moved on around him. He watched his friends get married, have children, and celebrate milestones he and Elena were missing. Loneliness became his constant companion, a shadow that followed him everywhere. He held onto the image of the woman he married, the vibrant, smiling Elena from the fair. That image of her was what kept him going. It was his guiding star in the darkest of nights. He imagined her return, replaying the scene in his mind 1,000 times. He would see her walking down the path to their house, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. He would run to her, hold her, and never let her go. This fantasy was his shield against despair. It was the promise of her return that gave him the strength to endure the endless days and sleepless nights. He was not just waiting, he was actively preserving their love, keeping the flame alive in the face of a relentless, unforgiving wind. 11 years is a long time. It's long enough for a child to be born and learn to ride a bike, for seasons to change more than 40 times, for the world to transform in countless ways. For Mark, those 11 years felt like a lifetime spent in a silent movie. The world outside the prison walls continued its noisy, chaotic dance, but his own world was muted, suspended in a state of perpetual anticipation. He had become an expert at waiting, a master of solitude. He learned to find comfort in routine, in the familiar patterns of his lonely existence. He kept their house pristine, a perfect time capsule of the day she left. Inside the prison, Elena was living a different kind of silence. The loud, clanging reality of her daily life was a stark contrast to the quiet, internal world she retreated into. She was surrounded by noise, but felt utterly alone. She read Mark's letters, each one a painful reminder of the life she had lost and the man she had hurt. Shame was a heavy cloak she wore every day. She saw the years stealing her youth, carving lines of worry onto her face and hardening her spirit. She was no longer the carefree woman from the fair. Prison had changed her, molding her into someone she barely recognized in the mirror. Their weekly visits became a strange ritual, a bridge across two vastly different worlds. They would sit across from each other, separated by a thick pane of glass, speaking through a telephone receiver. They talked about the weather, about books she was reading, about mundane details of his work. But the most important things remained unsaid. How could he describe the depth of his loneliness? How could she explain the fear and shame that consumed her? The glass between them was more than just a physical barrier. It was a symbol of the emotional distance that had grown between them over the years of forced separation. The silence was filled with assumptions. Mark imagined her as the same woman he had married, just waiting to be set free. He held on to a memory, an idealized version of Elena, untarnished by time or hardship. He didn't see the subtle changes in her eyes during their visits, the weariness that clung to her like a second skin. Elena, in turn, imagined Mark living a full life without her, perhaps even finding comfort in new friendships. She couldn't fathom the true extent of his solitary vigil. They were two people, bound by a shared past, living in separate silences, each creating a fantasy of the other to survive the pain. The day of her release arrived. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind Elena had always loved. Mark woke up before the sun, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. After 4,015 days of waiting, this was it. The end of the long, lonely wait. He dressed carefully, choosing the same blue shirt she had once said was her favorite. He drove to the prison, the familiar road now feeling completely different. It was a road leading not to a brief, supervised visit, but to a new beginning. He clutched the steering wheel, his knuckles white, a nervous smile playing on his lips. He was finally bringing his wife home. He waited outside the imposing gates, a small bouquet of her favorite daisies in his hand. Every person who walked out made his heart leap. Then he saw her. A woman emerged, squinting in the bright sunlight. She was thinner than he remembered, her hair cut short and streaked with gray. She wore clothes that seemed ill-fitting, and she walked with a hesitation he had never seen before. For a moment, he didn't recognize her. This was not the vibrant, confident Elena he had held in his memory for 11 years. This was a stranger. She saw him, and a flicker of something, relief, fear, uncertainty, crossed her face. She walked towards him, her steps slow and measured. He met her halfway, the bouquet of daisies suddenly feeling foolish in his hand. He pulled her into a hug, an embrace he had dreamed of for over a decade. But it felt wrong. It was like hugging a stranger. Her body was stiff, her arms limp at her sides. The warmth, the familiar scent, the feeling of home he had expected to find in her arms. It wasn't there. They pulled apart, and the silence between them was heavier than any prison wall. The drive home was excruciatingly quiet. Mark tried to fill the silence with small talk, pointing out new buildings and changed landscapes. Elena just nodded, her gaze fixed on the world outside the window, a world that had moved on without her. When they pulled into the driveway of their home, She stared at it as if it were a museum from a life that belonged to someone else. He unlocked the door and stepped aside to let her in. "Welcome home," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. She stepped inside, and the man who had waited 11 years felt a deep, gut-wrenching certainty. His wife was gone. They moved around each other like ghosts in the house that was once their sanctuary. Mark had kept everything just as she had left it, thinking it would be a comfort. Instead, it was a painful reminder of the life they could no longer reclaim. The photographs on the mantelpiece showed a smiling, happy couple he no longer recognized. He would watch her as she touched familiar objects: a ceramic mug, a worn armchair, with the tentative curiosity of a visitor. The woman he had waited for, the woman who lived so vividly in his mind, was an illusion. The reality was this quiet, hesitant stranger who shared his home. The truth was not in what they said, but in what they didn't. They didn't talk about the past 11 years. Her time in prison was a locked room they were both afraid to enter. His years of solitude were a landscape too bleak to describe. They tried to fall back into old routines, but the rhythm was gone. He'd make her favorite dinner, and she would eat it with polite detachment. He'd suggest watching a movie, and she would agree, her eyes vacant as she stared at the screen. The love that had sustained him for so long was built on a memory, and the memory had faded, replaced by this stark, uncomfortable reality. One evening, about a week after her return, Mark found her standing in front of the full-length mirror in their bedroom. She was just staring at her reflection, her expression a mixture of confusion and sorrow. She traced the lines on her face, the unfamiliar texture of her hair, the way her body had changed. He saw in her eyes a profound sense of loss, a disconnect from the person she used to be. It was in that moment he understood. It wasn't just that she had changed for him, she had changed for herself. The woman in the mirror was a stranger to her too. The decision to divorce was not made in anger or betrayal. It was a quiet, heartbreaking admission of a devastating truth. A few days later, sitting at the kitchen table, Mark finally spoke the words that had been hanging between them. "This isn't working, is it?" he asked softly. Elena didn't look surprised. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she nodded. "I'm not her anymore, Mark," she whispered. "The woman you waited for, she doesn't exist." It was a confession born not of a lack of love, but of the painful recognition that their love belonged to two people who were gone. The divorce was not the dramatic climax of their story, but a somber, quiet conclusion. It was the final acknowledgement that the bond they once shared had been irrevocably broken by time and circumstance. The man who had shown unwavering loyalty for 11 years was now letting go. It wasn't because his love had died, but because the person he loved had. He had been loyal to a memory, to the ghost of a woman who lived in his heart. The physical, living person in front of him was someone else entirely, and to pretend otherwise would have been a lie. The core of the issue was a profound physical and spiritual transformation. Prison had stripped Elena of her former self. The physical changes, the weight loss, the graying hair, the hardened posture, were merely an outward manifestation of a deeper, internal shift. She had survived by becoming someone else, someone tougher, more guarded, and more isolated. She had built walls around her heart to endure the daily trauma of her environment. When she was released, she couldn't simply tear those walls down. They had become a part of her, a permanent feature of her new identity. For Mark, this transformation was a shock he could not overcome. He had fallen in love with Elena's vibrant spirit, her easy laughter, and her open heart. The woman who returned was cautious, quiet, and carried the weight of her past in her eyes. He looked at her and saw the ghost of the woman he loved, but he couldn't connect with the person she had become. It was a cruel twist of fate. His loyalty, which had been his greatest strength, now highlighted the impossible chasm between them. He had waited for a person, but time had delivered a stranger. This story forces us to look at the complexity of attraction and connection. We like to believe that true love transcends the physical, that it's a union of souls. But we are also physical beings. Our identities are tied to our bodies, our expressions, the way we move through the world. When that physical presence changes so drastically, it can disrupt the very foundation of a relationship. It wasn't that Elena was no longer beautiful, it was that she was no longer her. The divorce was a tragedy not of failed love, but of lost identity. It was a testament to how deeply we can be changed by life's harshest trials. What does this story teach us about love? It teaches us that love is not a static thing, not a monument carved in stone. It is a living, breathing entity that must be nurtured by shared presence and experience. Mark's love was kept alive in a vacuum, fed by memories and hope. But without the daily interactions, the shared laughter, and the ability to grow together, it became a relic of the past. His loyalty was a beautiful, noble act, but it couldn't bridge the gap created by 11 years of separate lives and separate transformations. Love needs more than just memory to survive. It needs a present and a future. The story also shines a light on the profound impact of change. We all change over time, but usually, couples change together. They witness each other's evolution, adapting and growing in unison. Mark and Elena were denied this. They were forced to change in isolation, becoming two different people on parallel paths that could no longer intersect. Her change was drastic and forced by trauma, while his was a slow erosion caused by loneliness and waiting. When they were finally reunited, they were no longer a matched pair. They were two strangers with a shared history. Ultimately, this is a story about acceptance and the painful grace of letting go. Mark had to accept that the woman he had devoted his life to waiting for was gone. Elena had to accept that she could never go back to being the person she once was. Their divorce was not an act of abandonment, but an act of mutual respect. It was an acknowledgement that they couldn't force a connection that no longer existed. It was the kindest, most honest thing they could do for each other, allowing them both the freedom to heal and start anew, separate from the ghosts of their shared past. The love between Mark and Elena was real. The tragedy is that it belonged to a specific time and place, to two people who were swept away by a tide of misfortune. Their story is a heartbreaking reminder that even the strongest love can be tested beyond its limits. It reminds us that loyalty is a powerful force, but it cannot conquer all things. Sometimes, the most loving act is to recognize when a story has ended, to close the book gently, and to carry the memory of what was beautiful, even as you walk away. Their love didn't fail. It simply became a part of a past they could no longer live in.